Good morning. On behalf of the Department of Economics, Presidency University, Kolkata, I welcome you all to the third Bhabatosh Datta Memorial Lecture. The department is organizing the lecture since 2022 in memory of our legendary teacher, Professor Bhabatosh Datta. Professor Bhabatosh Datta started his career by working briefly at the Chittagong College and then Bardwan Raj College, and then briefly um, in the Ripon College, later known as Surendranath College, and Islamia College in Kolkata, later renamed Maulana Azad College. In 1948, he went to England to submit his doctoral dissertation at the London School of Economics. His dissertation was published in Calcutta as the Economics of Industrialization. After his return in 1952, he joined the Presidency College, Kolkata as Professor of Economics. The following year, he joined IMF as Chief of South Asia Division, where however, he returned to India in 1956 and rejoined Presidency College, where he continued to work till his retirement in 1962 as head of the department. Thereafter, he remained emeritus professor at the college and started working in state education ministry as he became the director of public instruction, Department of General Education, and in 1965, secretary of education, Government of West Bengal. He also remained a member of the Fourth Finance Commission of India, formed in 1964. In 1990, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, the second highest civilian award by the Government of India. Till his death in 1997, he continued to publish regular columns on the state of Indian economy and society. His books include The Evolution of Economic Thinking in India, Economic Development and Exports, a study of the impact of Indian economic development on exports, essays in plan economics, economics of industrialization, and many other. In words of Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi, Bhabatosh Datta belonged to that generation of Indian economists who regarded national planning as a sine qua non of economic development in an independent India and devoted the major part of their professional writings to the illumination of problems of planning and development. In words of Dev Kumar Bose, Bhabatosh Datta's personality made him an outstanding human being as a teacher and administrator with vision, exceptional clarity of thought, and a deep understanding of human nature. This memorial lecture is our humble tribute to this legendary teacher. And this year, we are honored to have Professor Amitava Krishna Datta with us to deliver the memorial lecture. Professor Datta is Professor of Economics and Political Science, University of Notre. He is the Fellow Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies and Kellogg Institute of International Studies. He completed his BA in 1975 from Presidency College. He completed his MA in 1977 and he received his PhD from MIT in 1983. Professor Datta's area of specialization are macroeconomic theory, development economics, international economics, and political economy. His current research focuses on global uneven development and globalization, models of growth and distribution, consumption and happiness, and the political economy of war and peace. He is the editor or author of several books, including Growth, Distribution, and Uneven Development, Crossing the Mainstream, Development Economics and Structural Macroeconomics, International Handbook of Development Economics, Happiness Economics and Politics, and many others. He has been the author of over 140 papers published in edited volumes and economic journals. He is a co-editor of the international journals Metroeconomica, and he previously served as chairperson of the economics department at the Notre University. So this year we are really honored to have Professor Datta with us. So with this, I would now request Professor Datta to kindly take over and deliver the lecture.
Thank you very much, Gagori, and thank you for the kind words. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to give the Bhabatosh Datta Memorial lecture. I don't think we are relatives, as far as I know, but we share the same last name, but we also share interest in development economics. I never had the good fortune of meeting him. Uh, Probably it would not have been possible, although I'm old. Um, Still, I couldn't uh, didn't have a chance to meet with him. But during our undergraduate days, I remembered reading his book on industrialization. I was trying to see if I could get a copy to look at it, but I couldn't find it on the World Wide Web, unlike many other books. Um, but what I was struck was um, his fairly independent-minded thinking about development and industrialization. Of course, those days, heterodox ideas were quite common in development economics. So he was a part of that. And also, he was very much interested outside economics, narrowly defined, in working on society, but also history, literary criticism, all kinds of different things. So he was a great scholar and from what I can tell, a wonderful human being. So it's a great honor for me and a privilege to be here to talk in his honor. I thought I should also mention, not to take any focus away from Bhabatosh Babu, about our recent loss of Omio Babu, who, as you know, passed away uh, just a few days ago. Um, and both of them, in many ways, have influenced my thinking about the issues that I will talk about. So I gave a fairly long title to my talk, which is almost like a kitchen sink. Uh, Everything is in it. Um, so I called it a structuralist analytical political economy perspective on economic development with special reference to India. That's quite a mouthful. There are many terms here. And what I will do is first um, talk about some terms. What do I mean by structuralist? What do I mean by political economy? What about economic development? And also, why leave out analytical? So, what do I mean by analytical? So, I will first of all try to introduce these terms and specify what exactly I mean by them for the purposes of this talk today, but also things that I think are very useful ways of thinking through many problems that beset uh, countries in the world, especially the relatively lower income countries. Uh, so this will be a bit like a long introduction, much like an alap in a rag. Um, and following that, I will contrast the approach I will use on these issues like structuralist and political economy to other approaches in economics, um, that is neoclassical, Marxian, um, and institutionalist, um, gender, or feminist, ecological, and there are many others. I obviously can't go into many of them, but I will very briefly discuss some of these others in comparison to the approach I will follow here. Um, and I think my partiality to the structuralist political economy will be very clear, although I do not like to, but sometimes I do denigrate some alternative approaches. So I know some of you may be wedded to those, so I apologize for what might seem somewhat of a combative style, which I will try to avoid. Um, and the third thing I will do is to look at how a country like India can be analyzed using this perspective. And to do so, I will not present a model. It's hard to go through a model and also could be quite boring. So instead, I will give a general sketch of the approach using uh, words instead of equations, but they will imply some equations, but it's important to say that it's not just equations. There are some other things that go beyond equations. So that's the step 3. And the final part, I will
SS.
sorry?
So,
Yes? It's okay? Oh, okay. So, and the final part will be to um, analyze one specific issue uh, on economic development in India, and that is the uh, big problem of inequality of income and wealth. So those are my 4 parts. Um, so to start with, um, what do I mean by the terms, the 4 terms that I've mentioned? Uh, the structuralist, political economy, uh, analytical, and economic development. Now, you might say, we know all that. Well, yeah, we know all that, but please humor me. I will use them in somewhat specific and in some cases non-standard ways. So I will start with political economy. Now, um, when somebody uses the word political economy or the terms political economy, it's not very clear what they mean. Uh, a lot of people mean by that the work of Karl Marx and his followers, which looked at how the economy is the base for um, income distributional issues and how that feeds into um, social institutions and into political structures and so forth. So it is quite a broad way of looking at the economy. Others mean by it what you might call rational choice theory, which is to use the neoclassical ideas of the optimizing individual and to see how these individuals behave not only in the economy, but also in the political arena. And another one which is quite popular in the West, as revealed by the names of some journals, is what is called heterodox economics. That is, economic ideas that are opposed to, say, the mainstream neoclassical one. Um, these are all useful definitions, but the one I will use is is not um, sectarian in the ways that these are. Instead, it is a way of thinking about society which um, looks at three parts of the economy, or the parts of the society, I should rather say, which is the economy and the polity, third, the society, all of these with small letters, and the three together comprise capital S, society, for lack of a different word. Now, the economy can be thought of as a system which answers some questions. The first economics textbook that I ever read, before even coming to Presidency College, just a few, well, now Presidency University, was to read Paul Samuelson's book. I don't know if anybody reads that yet, and reads that anymore, but I like the idea that the economy is the study of an economic system. Well, so far so good. Doesn't tell us anything. But what is an economic system? It answers, it's a system that answers some questions about what is produced, how it is produced, and produced for whom, and how these things change over time. So I think that is still a very, very useful way of thinking about the economy. Um, and it leaves open the question is what is included in production, but I won't go into that now. Um, Also, as Alfred Marshall told us in his book Principles of Economics, is it is the study of individuals in the daily business of life, or words to that effect, by which I think he meant, judging from his book, consumption, production, exchange, asset holding, um, all these working um, for a living, that is. So, all these kinds of activities. So, it is the system in which these kinds of behaviors are undertaken. Society, of course, uh, um, maybe I'll go alphabetically. The polity is one which is a system that makes decisions about the society as a whole. That is how it is governed, what uh, what the government does, what role the state plays, sections of the state like the bureaucracy, the executive, uh, legislature, etc., and also about political parties. And also, you can think of it as arena where people do some activities like voting, like making policies, uh, participating in the elections, these kinds of things. So you can see that uh, I'm trying to say there's a systemic view and there's a behavioral view of each of these. And finally, society with a small s is one where you have people interacting in ways other than normal buying and selling, that is, within families, within kinship groups, uh, in social clubs of various kinds, and also where systemically there are social norms that develop, ideas about culture, and so forth. So, um, political economy is one that says that these three parts of capitalist society cannot be studied by themselves in isolation. For example, it is common to say economics studies the economy, political science studies the polity, and sociology studies the society. But I would argue that this is very limiting and probably quite dangerous in overcoming many important ideas. Um, in neglecting many important ideas for a variety of reasons. One is that both we as analysts and individuals in society do not have one kind of objective, but they have multiple objectives of being, for instance, making a living, consuming, but also making friends and being a part of the political system. Uh, and as analysts, we also think about a good functioning democracy, maybe, and a society which is controls conflicts, and there is also economic development of some sort, which I'll come to later. The two other points is that these different segments the three separate segments, as we can think of them, actually have arrows going from one to the other, every possible way that there are things happening in one that affect the other. And it's not just effects, but it's also that there is what you might call the co-determined, constitution, co-constitution of particular things, which includes behavior, which includes institutions that are not just in one of these different things. For example, where would you put the state? The state is an institution. Now, it is neither only in the economy nor in the polity or in society. It's in all three of the things. And if you miss out one, you miss out a lot of things. Um, Not just institutions, but also think of behavior. What is consumer behavior? Is it an economic matter? Certainly is. It is a social matter? Yes. You try to express yourselves and you get affected by others. You try to build your own identity. And it can also be political, like, for example, the um, Khadi movement or of boycotting imported goods, for instance. So, political economy, therefore, is a approach to study any social um, entity, social um, system, and it cannot be separated by just saying, I want to do economics. Incidentally, these three things are just parts of a broader picture, which should also include psychological factors and historical, philosophical, many, many other things. Um, Let me next turn to so my idea here of the defining political economy is one that looks into how this society is actually comprised of three interrelated and interlocking systems, if you will. And this can be done in many, many ways, um, some of which I mentioned already, the Marxian one or the neoclassical one. And the economic development, I think still people mean generally per capita income and its growth. Of course, people also mean by it structural change, that is industrialization, and then for some countries, including India, it is becomes post-industrial and the rise of the service sector, as people used to say sometimes. India really got a double promotion right from agriculture to services without a intervening stage of industrialization. Uh, Third, of course, poverty. But I would say that the most important issue to me, and probably for the society as a whole, is inequality of income and wealth. Let me just give two reasons for this. Um, One reason is that just reducing poverty or improving what are called capabilities and functionings, as in Amartya words, um, it does some good, but it is not enough if inequality remains high. In India, there have been improvements in recent years on most of the indicators like literacy rates, like female schooling, um, health indicators, some more than the others. But this is certainly an improvement. But if you look at the distribution of income and wealth, that has been increasing in terms of inequality. And in many senses, for instance, in the sense of people feeling left out economically or socially, it is the gap that matters a lot. In terms of political um, clout, it is not the absolute amount of money people have, but the relative amount that matters. This is even true in rich countries like in the United States. So that's one reason. And the second reason is that uh, inequality has many effects on other things that we might consider valuable. For example, economic growth, while not being the central issue of development, certainly does matter to some extent, especially if it's equitable growth and especially if it creates employment. So much for economic development. Recently, there have been attempts to go beyond per capita income and its distribution and to introduce issues related to subjective well-being, which takes you closer to neoclassical theory of utility and increases in utility. And also, as I mentioned, functions and capabilities. But I will focus mainly on inequality in the rest of the discussion. By analytical, uh, everybody wants to be analytical and not just telling a story. Um, I would like to distinguish between just a narrative of what happened, which is can be called a description, um, and one that provides reasons for why some things have happened and the way they've happened. And that you might call thick descriptions, as is the term that's used by some people. But by analytical, I mean something more than that, which means it is something that relates how different elements of the system, so to speak, relate to each other and how they might even co-constitute different elements of these three different um, aspects of society, capital society that I mentioned. And so it could be expressed in equational terms, but sometimes not in equational mathematical terms, because mathematics implies that you should have some regular relationships between these different things, and those might just simply not exist. Um, and finally, I come to the third term, which is structuralist approach. What do I mean by the structuralist approach? Now, this again has many different meanings. Um, for those of you who uh, are widely read in terms of uh, intellectual pursuits, what we used to call atel uh, in student days. I'm using that word after a long time. Maybe I feel I'm in presidency. But in any case, they talk about structuralism of linguists like Saussure, or like cultural anthropologists like Levi Strauss, or it could be psychologists like Piaget. So all kinds of different writers in all kinds of schools, in all kinds of different disciplines, as it were. In economics, they've been used mainly by early developmental scholars, both in Europe, partly in America, but that is North America, but mainly in South America, Latin America, um, where people like Prebisch uh, and um, Furtado, the Brazilian, and many others developed systems in which they analyzed what what was happening. My own teacher, Lance Taylor, uh, has also used this and tries to formalize some of the ideas of these scholars, and I owe a great debt to his way of thinking. Now, why? What is the common feature of structuralism in all these different approaches? Some people think that structural approaches just introduce rigidities or lags or things like that that create imperfections or distortions in the economy or in the society. This is one way of viewing things, but it begs the question, what does imperfection mean? Uh, it must imply there's something called perfect. And what is a distortion? Again, it means something about an undistorted system. So, what most of the people who think in these terms usually um, talk about is a departure from a smoothly functioning system, much as such as what is described in, say, a neoclassical Walrasian arrow de Brue type of system with no frictions and everything is smooth, and where the markets work uh, through price changes, which gives signals to different actors and so forth. And if there is some sort of problem there, uh, which prevent these signals from working, because they are not they don't give the proper signals, or if the signals that different agents receive are not things that push them into doing appropriate things as required by the Walrasian model, then you have distortions. So this is one view that really starts with individual agents and puts them together, and then tries to say, well, structures imply some sort of um, technological, behavioral, or institutional rigidities. Now, what I mean by structures is what I think most people mean by it, who have looked at this carefully, is to take a systemic or holistic view, is to have an idea of the whole system and think of different parts of the system as being essentially parts of it, and you cannot understand these parts without understanding the whole system and its structure. That is, how is the whole system structured? Now, this is somewhat vague, so let me try to put some more specificity to this by saying that, well, let's have a system where we can write down a few equations. In looking at economic things, we can look at, for example, the national income accounting equations. And we can look at uh, production equations, consumption, investment, government, and how net exports adds up to production. And income, of course, looks at income, wages, maybe rent, interest, profit. So these are some accounting relationships. And you can also have, of course, financial relations like the total amount of financial assets sums up, all the different kinds of assets, and also how these things change over time. For example, how with accumulation savings, you can have changes in different kinds of um, um, things like money, like stocks, bonds, all of these kinds of things, financial matters. And also, for example, some things to do with foreign payments. So you have all these accounting relationships that look at the whole system and how these different things actually work is not specified. You have to have some more meat in them, some more theoretical ideas, like, for example, consumption income or relative income of peoples. So it is to look at the system as a whole, and you can see right away that what you have is the economy, and which helps about income and production. It helps to look at those things. It looks at society, which looks at how social behavior makes people want to consume more or less. It also um, involves the government when it decides how much to tax, how much to spend, how much money to create, and so forth, and what kind of policies. So all of these things can become part of this system. Now, we haven't talked about, at least I haven't mentioned the word agents. Um, and it is a word that I'm not very fond of, uh, agents. And that is because it is hard to define what an agent is without looking at the system itself, the system as a whole, I mean. So I have now gone through in very brief and sketchy terms, sketchy both in terms of content, but in terms of also perhaps its nature. What I mean by political economy, what I mean by economic development, what I mean by analytical, and what I mean by the structuralist approach. To repeat, the structuralist approach is to look at the whole system as the starting point, and then seeing how different parts of it fit in terms of different sectors, perhaps different social groups, um, different institutions, and so forth. Now, so that's the first point, and I think I've spent perhaps too much time. It's a long and extended alap. Uh, Let me now turn to the next point, which I'll be relatively quick, except for a couple of points. Um, How does this approach compare to other approaches to looking at societies? Um, One thing is clear, that it takes a broader view, that it goes beyond what is economics narrowly defined, although many other groups are starting to do that as well. As I already mentioned, Marxian approach does, of course, go beyond the economy, although the economy, the material basis, is still the basis, which is the driving force. Um, but on it is built the superstructure of society, of culture, of government institutions, the state, and all those kinds of things. Um, Another group is the post-Keynesians, who follow Keynes. And I think one of the key features of post-Keynesian ideas is the focus on income distribution between classes, which is also shared with the Marxian approach of class struggle. So classes matter very much, and individuals, agents, especially the representative agent is a fictional creature which obfuscates rather than illuminates, one might say. And so distribution affects other economic factors like economic growth, employment, and so forth. And the second important feature of post Keynesianism is what is called uncertainty. Um, Uncertainty, I think many of you are probably familiar with that. In Keynes's general theories, I forget which chapter, the second of the investment chapters, I think it's chapter 7, he talks about uncertainty and the difference between risk and uncertainty, where risk is situations where the future is not known, but it can be estimated probabilistically, more or less, based on either frequentist empirical analysis or just logic. So heads and tails, toss a coin, or he even mentions the roulette wheel. These are matters of risk. But on most matters in life, I think the outcomes are not known, and even the payoffs may not be well known, and so we simply do not know. And this idea is a very important one that the post-Keynesians have explored: how people behave when you simply do not know. Should they just say, well, I won't get up from bed, I'll just lie down and do nothing because who knows what's going to happen? No, they do things. And you can understand what they do only by studying what they do, not by just spinning theories. Uh, Gender, of course, the feminist approaches focus rightly on the great differences that exist between men and women or the social roles that they have been assigned. Um, and it is, again, looking at a representative agent or a sexless agent really means that you're looking at the so-called man rather than um, noting differences. Ecological approaches say that you got to look at how the economy affects the environment, nature, and feedback on it. Now, the main, uh, the most illuminating way of understanding structural approach to something else is the neoclassical one. The neoclassical one can be said, people just use the word neoclassical. What do they mean by it? I think there are at least two ways of thinking about it. One is that you use the optimizing agent, an individual optimizing agent. And this really involves two different ideas. One is that of optimization, that is trying to solve a mathematical problem of maximization or minimization. And second, that is done by an individual, usually an individual meaning a person. But of course, it's taken also to look at firms sometimes, although others have gone into within the firm to look at optimization there as well. Um, when I studied at presidency, then college, the theory was all about neoclassical economics. I, mm, I'm not sure what is done today, but when I went to Katakol, which was to study masters, there were some teachers that talked about Kalechki and Strafa. And we kind of thought this is rubbish. What are these? What's going on here? Who is maximizing? What are they maximizing? And I think it was Arup Mullik who taught us about these things, and he laughed. Now I can understand why he laughed, or maybe he laughed for other reasons. But to me, it is not obvious who a person is, who an individual is. An individual, the more we learn about neuroscience and cognitive issues, we understand how um, we are not actually unified agents. And also, going beyond the individual, sometimes in groups, we act in a certain way which cannot be reduced to individual behavior simply because of relationships of power within the group, let us say. So, uh, and then about optimization, the defense is usually about, well, we are all rational. Now, I can't see you, but if I asked you, how many of you think you are rational? When I do this, most people look at each other and they put their hands up. And very few actually say, no, I'm not rational. So, what are you? Well, irrational. Um, of course, these ideas about rationality are not very clear at all. But in my mind, rationality is an empty idea. It is at most telling us, set up a mathematical model and maximize it. But maximize what? Utility, let us say. But that depends on what's happening, what's going to happen when we do some things. And this implies a consequentialist idea, as people have recognized. But moreover, they know what's going to happen when they do something. But in an uncertain world, which we mentioned before, you don't really know what's going to happen. So, what do you do? Do you write a mathematical model and say, well, these are the expectations, and at least probabilistically, we'll know, no, that's not possible. Okay, I could go on with this, but time is moving. So let me now um, do a brief outline of a structuralist political economy approach for India. Now, one key issue that we have learned over the last 40 years or so. And here I must credit uh, Professor Omio Bagchi, who was among the first to point out the importance of aggregate demand issues um, in low income countries. Earlier, scholars like V.K.R.V. Rao, A.K. Dasgupta, even Mikhail Kalevsky all thought that uh, low income countries were poor because of supply constraints, not because of aggregate demand. But since then, the wind has changed, and people have recognized that even in the poorest countries, demand plays a very important role. Uh, do people actually buy things, or do they just hide their income or buy gold if they can afford it, or just put the money, dig it into a hole? And what happens as a result of this? Now, in an uncertain world, and even low income countries are more uncertain because of the institutions are not very clearly set out, aggregate demand plays an extremely important role in determining production and its growth. So this has to be taken into account. A second feature that must be taken into account is the great differences in the living conditions of different peoples. Uh, I don't know if people still use, at least in the secrecy of their um, homes, words like Bhadralok and Chotalok. Um, I hope they don't, but at least I still hear them when I travel in India. Now, this is not just for India; it's for many other countries as well. But the class division is extremely, extremely acute. in a country like India, and you have to think of different people as being in very different um, states of existence. And this has been recognized by a lot of people in their work on India. For example, Professor Pranab, who has written about dominant classes and non-dominant classes. I won't go into the whole details of this, but I should mention at least one should distinguish between the rich, which includes the super rich, and the lower income uh, poor, which might be a very large number um, in a country like India, many of them working in production, which is um, not so much of goods but of services. And this is the third point, that there are organized sectors and unorganized sectors. I have seen some studies which show that uh, employment in India can be as high as 90% in the unorganized or the informal sector. I've seen different numbers, but these are quite high. Um, a final idea that should be mentioned is that uh, the Indian economy um, still has a large agricultural sector, um, and that should be taken into account. I shouldn't say this is the final, this is the fourth element. And the fifth element that should be taken into account is the foreign sector. That is, there's imports, exports, and capital flows. And imports and exports can lead to trade deficits. And if there's economic growth, usually the imports increases, and this creates a problem with the balance of payments, which has to be taken into account. There are other equations that, other things that have to be taken into account, but I don't have time to go through them. Now, so one key is the informal sector. And the question is, what what is done in the informal sector and how does it interact with the formal sector? Let's take the formal sector as organized production, factory production. Now, how does the informal sector um, relate to it? One is not at all, that it's a self contained sector where the people produce and they consume their own products. Uh, that can be coarse textiles, you know, services for each other, and so forth. Another is that maybe they produce a, a product or services that are an input into the formal sector. So one has to specify that these are all different possibilities, and one can play around with different ways of setting up the system to study how the different sectors interact. Okay, let me now jump to the final point, which is uh, something that interested me from my days as a student in presidency, which is the idea that inequality leads to stagnation. Um, and the question is uh, that it used to be thought that, at least among the classical economists like Ricardo or Adam Smith, that saving drove capital accumulation, and saving was done mostly by capitalists. Not all the rich people saved. For example, the landlords were just wasters. They didn't save, they just had a good life and had servants and so forth. Um, with the exception of Reverend Malthus, who himself was a reverend, he thought that landlords and um, you holy people like him, their spending actually might contribute to aggregate demand, but most of them thought that savings drove economic growth. Now, the recognition of aggregate demand and its importance that I mentioned before leads to the idea that consumption plays a very important role in determining output and its growth. And not only that, it also has an impact on investment and technological change. Investment because firms get higher profits if aggregate demand is high, and then they will be investing more, leading to more capital accumulation, and saving will rise as a consequence of the rise in income. And this will also, with production taking place and growing capital accumulation, you're going to have more technological change because of learning by doing and other mechanisms of this sort. And um, so, if this is true, then it would seem that improving the distribution of income and having lower income people have a larger share of the income will lead to higher aggregate demand, higher profits, higher growth, and so forth. And the opposite would happen if we had an unequal distribution of income, then output and aggregate demand would be low, and so forth. These are now well established ideas, but I have to say that when I was doing my dissertation research, it was not so obvious. Um, and I tried to do some work on these issues. Now, one can raise the question, as has been raised, that is it really true that if you improve the income distribution, make it more equal, you're going to have higher growth? And some people have pointed out that it need not happen that way. Let me give you two examples. One that was pointed out by Amit Bhaduri, who I believe gave last year's Bhabatosh Datta Memorial Lecture, argued that in a paper with Stephen Marglin, that in fact, if you improve the income distribution, then what will happen is that wages would, the wage share would rise and the profit share would fall. And the profit share would make firms think that profitability is lower. And so, even though um, this shift towards wages could increase capacity utilization, it could reduce the share of profits, and this could lead to lower investment. So, overall, we can't really say. A second argument has been made, uh, which is that if it's an open economy, you can't even have an aggregate demand problem because the small open economy is a price taker, which takes as given the price and can sell any amount it wants to the world markets. And most countries are small, except maybe the US. And the third argument is the modified version, which says if you raise income distribution, wages will rise, and this will lead to less competitiveness amongst the producers because they have to pay higher wages, higher prices, and the competitiveness of exports will be hampered, and this will reduce growth. Now, I think that in a country like India, one has to think through these things more carefully. Um, and this is because of the existence of the informal sector. You can have informal sector growth, which will raise income in the informal sector, average income, let us say, with not much of an effect on the formal sector. There could be some effect because, of course, the formal sector incomes might depend on the alternative cost, the alternative incomes that are received outside the sector, Lewis style way, um, but it'll not be a huge effect. 90% of the people will not be affecting so much the conditions of 10%. So if you do that, then there is no, reason for profits in the large industrial sector to be higher. to be squeezed by a rise in wages. Nor is it true that the prices of export goods, at least modern exports, will be uh, hurt so much because goods produced in the informal sector may well be non-traded goods, and this will not affect competitiveness. Finally, this idea that a small economy uh, cannot have an effective demand problem, and therefore uh, you will necessarily have, if you improve the distribution of income, a reduction in saving and growth, is, I think, a very good example of the mischief done by neoclassical international trade theory. A small economy, it is said, has a fixed price. It is too small to affect the world price. But if you think of small countries, India is quite large, but still, if it's a small country, it might not be able to affect the price, the world price of certain things, but it is not going to be able to sell everything at the world at that world price because demand for India's products on export markets depend only partly on price, but in large part also on quality, perceptions of quality, uh, on marketing channels, all kinds of different things which are non-price in nature. And so this idea that small country, any small country can actually export any amount it wants to is really wishful thinking. That this is one of the most pernicious effects uh, of some kinds of neoclassical thinking that I know of. So, in fact, how to change the distribution of income and how to overcome the political problems of raising taxes on the rich, of um, can to some extent be blunted by focusing on the relatively poorest groups and raising their income by kinds of methods that are quite well known. But it is not only to raise their level of living, but to also have increases in income, which can actually increase aggregate demand and increase uh, economic growth in a way that does not uh, focus on productivity increases, because productivity increases sounds good, but it actually results in low employment growth. So I'll stop here. I've gone beyond my time. I'm sorry, Gagori, that I've gone a little beyond. But anyway.
Thank you, Amitava, so much for such a nice lecture. So now we are opening the floor for question and answer. So if you have any question, then please feel free to ask that.
Sir, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, Anindaba, you are audible.
Sir, you have mentioned that the income inequality is the main one of the main issues of the Indian economy. So how it can be reduced apart from income distribution from rich to poor?
Well, well, obviously you need to. I am quite an extremist in this view, uh, in the sense that uh, you don't need to have a redistribution from the rich to the poor. You can on one hand just increase the incomes of the poor without affecting the incomes of the rich by a variety of different measures, like, for instance, creating um, village industries, creating service sector jobs that are more um, not microcredit type, but more uh, small and medium-sized firms and so on. Now, you can also improve the income distribution just by taxing the rich and just not spending it. Okay, that will raise the income distribution too. I think that is an improvement, which would reduce income as a whole, but it still would reduce the power of the rich. So now people will say, well, how can you do that? But actually, I think everybody would be better off eventually. Uh, and how you do it, there are so many ways. Where will I start? Uh, and I think the ways in which it is more politically feasible are the ones that will have to be done. Um, um, in the current system, if the government is always so close to the Adanis and Ambanis of the country, then it's going to be very difficult to make bigger changes of the type that are needed. But I still think there's a lot of wiggle room for um, instead of thinking about large-scale industrialization with high technological change and modernization and exporting, I think a more internally focused uh, um, way of increasing um, production and demand may be necessary. This is not going to answer your question, obviously, but I think you get the general drift of what I'm saying. I hope.
Thank you, sir.
Any other question?
I just wanted to ask Amitava one other thing. Uh, the whole discussion is ultimately about income generation. Okay, still the focus is on GDP. So, where does wealth come into this? See, the thing is that one part of wealth is, accretion of income and savings, and you build your wealth. But the stock market is playing an interesting role now because you have a stock market where the small investors don't play a major role for a number of historical reasons. Okay. But you have the stock market where there are big players and the stock market is booming and wealth is being generated, which is actually being tom-tommed as an example of India shining or whatever, right? So you didn't have the time, I understand, but the financial sector and its role uh, in creating inequalities, right? I think that has to be brought in. So, what are your ideas about this? Maybe
No,
I'm, yeah.
yeah. No, I completely agree. Um, India is probably still not in a situation as in the United States, where financialization has grown to such an extent as I think Keynes said, the tail wags the dog. Uh, India, I don't think, has gone to that level yet, which is uh, what many people bemoan, that we should actually have more financialization, opening up the capital accounts and all of those kinds of things. And the large industrial houses, of course, get a lot of bank credit. But in India, which in our youth, we used to be told that look at these banks, they're all nationalized, they don't do anything. Okay, all they have is have tea. But then after the uh, Great Recession, India became a model of how banking should be done in a nationalized way. So India has some financial advantages both in the extent of financialization and in the way the banking structure is. So I don't think that these should be changed in the direction that many of the financial pundits want. And I think that the whole growth process should focus on sectors that do not rely on stock markets, but bank credit to a much larger extent. So now, how do you defeat the um, uh, financial people? I don't know. I think this is one place where um, you have to sort of pretend that they didn't happen and let financial markets be volatile and let organized investment go up and down as a result of that. Let there be speculation and so on, but let's shield the major part of the economy that involves many, many more people uh, who have very little wealth um, to do their own thing. Um, is this politically feasible? I don't know. Uh, but one thing which also bothers me is that the role of the middle class and the upper middle class. That there was a lot of indebtedness, credit card expansion, and so forth that was taking place. I don't know if that's still continuing, but also we were told uh, long ago by The Economist magazine that in the coffee house, things have changed. They used to discuss uh, um philosophers, and now they discuss the much more productive use of how to get. So it is also the mindset, I think, of the upper middle class or even the middle class to think in different ways um, that has to change. So wealth inequality is of course far more unequal than even income inequality in India. But you have to also remember that was it Adani who from the second richest man in the world became the 70th, and I don't know where he is now. Is these so-called fortunes come and go?
We have one question in the.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, good.
No, sir. You just raise the point, and after that we have a question in the chat box. Then after
Yeah.
you finish, then I'll be.
So I was trying to draw his attention to that question. So there is a question in the chat box if you want to.
From
Okay.
Rishabh Sachdev. The question is, since you talked about inequality, I want to know what is the underlying microeconomic theory of wage determination in the structuralist approach. Is it closer to the neoclassical theory where wages are determined by marginal productivity, or the Safavian approach where wages are exogenously determined?
Well, neither. It is certainly not dependent on the marginal product of labor. It's not even clear what marginal product of labor means. The sense that if you hire one more person, you don't know what the additional revenue from that will be. It will depend on not only, but also how much of labor will be used, that labor will be used, and finally how much will be sold. So this idea of marginal productivity pricing, of course, depends on perfect information, you know, profit maximization, blah, blah, blah. I won't go into the details. So it's certainly not that. Straffian system is a good way of distribution, but Straffa is too cryptic. There's no theory behind what it is. So he, for example, focuses on the interest rate being monetarily determined by money supply, monetary policy. I think that income distribution is determined to a large extent by power relations between uh, workers and capitalists in certain sectors. The informal sector, I think now India is experimented with labor organizations that have been able to increase um, their power to some extent. Um, so I think power relations are very important. And if you want to study that, you can look at Marx, of course, and you can look at Kaleski, but who have extended theories. The structuralist approach looks at different situations. Some contexts, it can be devastatingly problematic. More the neoclassical type, where lack of demand can push wages or average incomes to very low levels, where they don't have any kind of power uh, to maintain that. So I would definitely say Straffian is a good start, but just ask the question: what does exogenous mean? Exogenous has to be explained by some theory and some ideas about what determines it. And neoclassical systems, I think, are totally fictitious things.
Amitava, I enjoyed listening to your lecture. It was definitely very close to my heart, the sort of things you said. And what? Oh, someone has a question, I suppose. Should I
No,
stop, David?
no, sir. You just please
Okay.
carry on. After that, we shall be taking that
Okay.
question.
Okay. Amitava, a very interesting. It was a very short part of your lecture, but you mentioned it. You said, "I don't know if this is politically feasible." The kind of policy implications of your talk, if this is politically feasible. I thought that was a very important statement you made, not only when I look at the Indian condition, but even when I look at the latest election story in America, the way the rich help to bring people to power. And that is true in the Indian democracy also, to the way, at least so far as I understand, that the rich do play very important role in the electoral campaigns and to get people elected and so on. And to that extent, after getting elected, the government has an obligation towards the rich, however you define the rich, whether you in terms of wealth, whether you in terms of income or whatever, uh, and that's where I think, even though we talk about democracy, uh, democracy itself, if I were to say it in Bengali, "Shorsher moddhe bhut," so that there is a problem in democracy itself, especially when I think about the way you presented your thoughts. You brought it up very well. I think I like that point very much.
Well, thank you. Yes, and the sad part of it is that the tendency is going in the wrong direction, which is
Right.
the rule of money is becoming more important through electoral rules. Also, the role of the mafia raj is
Right.
becoming more important,
Right.
and there are reasons why the poor unlike in the United States, perhaps, which is a different, and I don't want to talk about that. I'm too upset about
Right.
things here. But since I live here, but it's the same thing. The question is, why doesn't the median voter model work? Okay, why don't they soak the rich? Because, and this is because you can please people in different ways. What the BJP has done to a large extent is to improve the living conditions to some extent in many parts through, say, RSS type social service work. And at least it seems that is no longer, BJP is no longer considered to be a party of the Brahmins and the Banias, but also it is getting increasing support from almost every group except for the Muslims. Okay, so uh, you know, if I read about the early days of democracy in England or the Chartist movements and things like that, how they thought by extending the vote to everybody, everything will be solved, and how the rich always find a way
Right.
of not only influencing elections, but also of setting the agenda of what is considered to be the important issue. Is it gender? Is it caste? Is it, all of these different issues? And somehow it's very, very difficult. But I don't think it is totally impossible. And I think here we can take a lesson from Gandhi, which is to uh, give up to some extent, keep the fight going, but not focus so much at the top, and try to have smaller groups in different um, states, perhaps in different localities, that could generate high incomes, bypass the whole. Now, I don't know if this is a pipe dream or not, but um, you know, I don't know if Gandhi's idea of trusteeship is really going to be. Um, of course, Gandhi said trusteeship is good, but if they don't behave, then have the unions attack them, and if they don't work, then have the state. But if the state is captured by the rich, then who is going to do that? So I think the grassroots things may have a bigger role to play.
Thank you, Amitava.
We have one question in the chat box by Parthiba Bandyopadhyay. How can structuralist approaches inform solutions to contemporary challenges like climate change and technological inequality in developing countries?
Well, the structuralist approach is, as I was saying, uh, an approach. It is a way of looking at the system as a whole. And if you, for example, think that ecological factors are extremely important, then they have to be addressed very clearly in these kind of ways of thinking about. And some structuralist writers have started looking at the environment as a part of this system. And there are some pretty obvious connections. For instance, environmental decay or destruction affects lower income groups more. I think this has been generally found to be true in most places, although most of the noise comes from city people who mm, who rightly don't like the pollution that's taking place in places like Delhi. Kolkata is probably doing better, right? Uh, but that is the lack of development, so to speak. Good for lack of development, okay, perhaps. Uh, but in any case, and also that uh, improvements in income distribution, if properly uh, formulated, can improve environmental conditions as well. Again, so you don't have to believe in the um, environmental Kuznets curve, which is again, uh, its fate is, I think, very much like the regular Kuznets curve. So environment, yes. Technological, yes. I mean, I think we should not think about efficiency and productivity. Hooray for inefficiencies, I will say, because it employs more people. Okay. And it lets people have a good time sometimes. Okay. Instead of rush, rush, rush and work. And um, efficiency is, as I see it, a concept made up by the rich to make the poor work harder and say, well, liberalize the markets and everything will be efficient. Efficiency is a big, big issue that ought to be attacked for whatever it is. I hope I'm not sounding like a curmudgeon here, but I think we should not be just looking at the cutting edge for everything. Now, in some sectors, it may be very important. In health, issues, I think it's extremely important. In some IT issues, it may be very important, but just productivity for its own sake, it just leads, I think, to job loss, and it leads to stress and a horrible life for people who are just chasing this, and for what? For getting more consumer goods.
Is there any other question?
If I could just say something, that the structuralist approach is not sidetracked by such constructions as the optimizing agent. It looks at real issues and it says, how do these real issues interact with each other in a part of a whole system? And it's very, very flexible, perhaps too flexible. But this is where, for instance, you can think of even village societies as being part of a system, and all the village societies together are maybe thought of as a representative village, okay, which can have interactions, but largely could even be self-sufficient. And so you can even think of micro analysis of this. And I even think that an individual has a structure. Well, it's not I think. People think and know that the brain has many things going on in it. Okay, some that push them to selfishness, some that push them to be selfless. Okay, and this is a constant tussle which is affected by what happens outside. So you can see the structuralist approach can be applied to all kinds of situations, from families to the individual to the village to the society, to include the natural world as well.
Any other question? Okay, so if there is no other question, then we can close the session. On behalf of the department, I would extend our sincere thank to Professor Amitava Krishna Datta to give us time. And I would like to thank all the participants who have joined. And with this, we are actually closing the session. Thank you all for participating. Thank you so much.
And thank you for inviting me, and thanks for all of you to take time from your busy Saturday to listen to my thoughts.